parents, community members, community organizations, and young folks. But I first met Pauline because we heard, when we were first starting our organization in 1999, that somewhere there was another Teachers for Social Justice. And it was an organization that Pauline found in Chicago, our sister organization, Teachers for Social Justice, or TSJ. So I'm really proud to announce our sister, Pauline Lipman. She's an amazing example of knowledge and action, on-the-ground organizing, as well as research and scholarship. So please join me in welcoming Pauline Lipman.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I need to get set up. But I know about 2,000 of you are out there. It's really amazing. Thank you so much, T4SJ, for organizing another amazing conference and for all the work you're doing. And I want to send greetings from Teachers for Social Justice in Chicago, TSJ folks in the house, a few of us, okay. So today I want to start out by talking about the moment we're in. We're in a moment, and it's important to name it. It's a moment of economic insecurity, extreme inequality, and political crisis, racist state violence, and anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic backlash, and it's a moment of bold new social movements for racial and economic justice and education justice. It's a crisis, it's a moment of danger and possibility, and education is very much at the center. In Chicago, we're 3 days away from another teacher strike.
Whoa.
Well, last week, 95% of Chicago Teachers Union members voted to authorize the strike. And on Tuesday, more than 50 further away, okay. No wonder. Did you hear any of what I said? On Tuesday, oh, that's so much better. More than 50 parent, neighborhood, and community organizations issued a statement in support. So we're gearing up for another battle in the protracted struggle for our schools and our city. This time we're demanding that the city take the money from real estate developers and the rich to fund our schools. So this is a huge battle. We're fighting for the schools our students deserve. The mayor and his appointed Board of Education forced this strike by driving the school district into massive debt and slashing school budgets. More than 1,000 school staffs were laid off in August, and special education staffing was cut drastically, hurting the most vulnerable students. Classrooms are overcrowded, and we've had drastic cuts to arts and music. Only 1/4 of the schools in Chicago have librarians. Budget cuts have forced cuts to school nurses, social workers, and counselors at the very time when there's an epidemic of violence in the city. At the same time, the Chicago Public Schools budget includes nearly $2 billion in private contracts for a wide variety of services. In 2013, CPS closed 50 schools despite 6 months of protests by thousands of parents and teachers and students. We've had over 160 school closings, turnarounds, phase-outs, and consolidations since 2001. Meanwhile, CPS has authorized 160 properly funded, but privately operated contract and charter schools. In 2015, those schools got an increase of nearly $64 million, while the school budgets for public schools were cut $140 million. From 2004 to 2014, CPS lost 30,000 students and added over 50,000 charter school seats. This has pushed thousands of teachers, especially black teachers, out of the system. Venture capitalists and Governor of Illinois, Bruce Rauner, said his goal is to, quote, blow up the Chicago School District and create smaller networks of schools competing for resources through charters, contracts, and independent providers. This is what we're up against. With the strike looming, eyes are on Chicago. But the budget cuts, school closings, and privatization we've experienced are national. Billionaire ventures, philanthropists, corporate think tanks, neoliberal policymakers, and CEOs want to blow up public education. They're strangling public schools, serving largely working-class children of color, and have been for the last 15 years, beginning with No Child Left Behind, which created the metrics for education markets and turned classrooms into test prep centers. In Chicago, we've had 20 years of these policies. Neighborhood high schools serving students of color were hit the hardest in current budget cuts. It's not just that there aren't books or science labs or librarians. As one parent said at a press conference this week, there's no joy. Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, an investment banker, said after the economic crash in 2008, quote, never waste a crisis to push your agenda. The fiscal crisis of state and city governments has created new opportunities to capitalize on public education. Citing school district budget problems and pension fund shortfalls, a private equity investor in Boca Raton, Florida, put it this way: there's more receptivity to change in education than ever before, and that creates opportunity. Local school districts are outsourcing all kinds of school services to private contractors and disinvesting and closing schools, mainly in low-income communities of color, to clear the way for privatization. This is what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. These are decisions that are made without consulting the parents, students, teachers, and communities affected. Detroit, New York, and Chicago have all closed more than 100 schools. Columbus, Ohio, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Houston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Baltimore have all had more than 25 public schools closed in recent years. At the same time, with backing by the U.S. Department of Education, privately run charter schools have increased to 6,800 nationally and counting, enrolling 3 million students. 60% are in urban areas. New Orleans is now an all-charter district. San Francisco hasn't had the mass school closings and privatization that we've had. But Oakland parents have lost control of many of their neighborhood schools due to school closings and privatization. 30% of Oakland schools are charter schools, and a quarter of all students attend charters. This agenda is a national agenda, and San Francisco is not immune. There's a train coming down the tracks, and it's coming your way. Billionaire venture philanthropists like Gates, Broad, and the Walton Foundation, Netflix CEO Reed Hastings, hedge fund managers, and other wealthy Wall Street investors have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into charter school expansion and pushed local and state government to pass pro-charter legislation. Walton plans to spend $1 billion over the next 5 years for charter schools. Broad is spending $500,000 to turn half of the Los Angeles school district, that's the second largest school district in the country, into charters. This is an agenda that's supported by both political parties, charter authorizing organizations, corporate think tanks, this whole corporate neoliberal cabal. And it's a global strategy. The World Bank's program is to open up all aspects of education to the market globally and gear schooling to job preparation, particularly for the flexible labor force. This is not an education agenda. It's a capital accumulation strategy. It's part of the neoliberal logic to turn every public good, water, bridges, highways, the postal service, into a commodity for profit. And there are so many ways to make profits off of the primarily black and brown children in urban schools. In the U.S. alone, K-12 education is a $650 billion industry. As journalist Stephanie Simon reported to Reuters in 2012, investors are, quote, pouring private equity and venture capital into scores of companies that aim to profit by taking over broad swaths of public education. Take charter schools. Education management organizations like K-12 Inc., which that's a Virginia-based company that's traded on the New York Stock Exchange, they skim management fees off of publicly funded charter schools. We pay taxes, they get part of the money. Transnational investors speculate on charter school bonds in the global financial markets. Real estate developers and hedge funds are pouring investment capital into charter school facilities, using new market tax credits designated for banks and equity funds that invest in community projects in so-called underserved communities. Investors can almost double their investment in 7 years. No wonder J.P. Morgan Chase created a $325 million pool to invest in charter schools. But this multi-pronged attack on public education has given birth to grassroots movements of resistance at the local level, and that resistance is coalescing in a national movement that is multi-issue, multi-race, and multi-class. There's an anti-testing opt-out movement, parents organizing against school closings and school district takeovers. We've had students doing walkouts across the country. The Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools just did walk-ins in 200 cities. And there are radical teacher organizations like T4SJ and insurgent teacher unions, not just in Chicago, but in LA and in Milwaukee and in Newark. The Journey for Justice Alliance of grassroots, community, youth, and parent-led organizations in 21 cities that was built and led by youth and parents of color are organizing against school closings and privatization as a racial justice issue, and for sustainable driven schools and education as a human right. So let me use Chicago as an example, and I actually want to correct or just modify a little bit something Karen said. In Chicago, Black and Latino parents began organizing together against school closings in 2004. And it was their resistance, actually, that gave birth to the core of the new leadership of the CTU. In 2012, the CTU led the first teacher strike in Chicago in 25 years with an anti-neoliberal, anti-racist program. The C of CTU Red, that took over Chicago for a week, announced a new day for teacher unions in this country. And they set a direction for teacher unions nationally. For a giant union that we call a social movement union that fights alongside teachers, alongside parents and students and community people, and that organizes itself like a social movement. And in Chicago, parents, teachers, students, and community organizations, along with the CTU, side by side, have consolidated into a multiracial alliance with Black and Latino community organizations at its core. That's actually who's at the core. The mayor and the powerful corporate interests cannot ignore this movement. Our movement was a major reason Rahm Emanuel almost lost his re-election bid in 2015. You can applaud for that. And why, in a February 2016 poll, 60% of people said they sided with the CTU on how to improve schools, compared with 20% who sided with Rahm. But the education movement is young, and we're fighting multiple systems of power that play out in education in specific and concrete ways in our different contexts. So I want to briefly reflect on some of the challenges that we have to tackle together in the course of actually doing it. So I'm going to start by talking about charter schools. And as you probably know, most of them are run or managed by charter organizations. And these are led by business CEOs, run by private boards, and staffed by a revolving door of too often inexperienced and generally underpaid, super exploited teachers without the benefit of mentorship of experienced teachers. At least that's our experience in Chicago. Some are for-profit companies, like 70% of the charter schools in Michigan. So they're getting public tax dollars. And many nonprofit charters contract out to for-profit education management organizations. But what we know from research and media accounts and too many parent and student stories is that these schools are excluding students with special needs and English language learners. They're pushing kids out of school based on their test scores or their behavior. They're instituting military discipline in some of the schools. They have cultural assimilationist practices and a test-driven curriculum. As a whole, these corporate charters are far from innovative, which is what their claim was. However, and I think this is an important point, the charter school landscape is complicated. Community organizations and groups of teachers and parents have also started independent charter schools. You have some in the Bay, right? Yeah. These schools are trying to be humanizing, culturally relevant, creative, justice-oriented schools. Some are in the tradition of Black independent schools. And we have some of these in Chicago too. But independent charter schools are actually few and far between. And like any industry under capitalism, the concentration of capital investment and the economy of going to scale tends toward consolidation in a few what they call industry leaders, i.e. corporate charter schools. So we know this. Where mom and pop coffee shops, independent bookstores, and neighborhood restaurants once stood, we have Starbucks, Amazon, and McDonald's. Independent charters struggle in this McCharter environment. And they're up against powerful interests that drive the expansion and corporate domination of the charter school industry. But on the ground, in schools and neighborhoods, some parents are choosing to send their children to these charter school chains too. And it's not just their marketing and their PR. Parents are trying to do the best they can for their children. They're trying to navigate disinvested, inequitable urban public school systems in the hope of a better, safer alternative. Too often, our organizing against privatization disparages parents and teachers who support charter schools. We have teachers who come to T4SJ meetings and are embarrassed to admit that they teach in a charter school. And we actually have more and more charter school teachers in TSJ. In Chicago, there have been shouting matches between Latino students and parents protesting a charter school expansion in their working class neighborhoods, and Latino charter schools and students, Latino charter school parents and students from the very same neighborhood defending the schools. The shiny new charter schools attract students and are bleeding the already disinvested public schools of students and funding, and that just justifies more school closings. But all the parents, charter and public, are trying to do the best for their children. They're trying to find a way in an education system that is not designed for them and never was. So the first challenge is, how do we connect charter school parents and public school parents and students and build a broader movement, an inclusive movement that includes all of us? How do we build a more inclusive movement that includes all of us, that actually want the same things for our children? And we need to remind ourselves, Black communities in particular, racialized immigrant communities, working class communities, have always had tenuous relationship to public schools that have not been safe spaces for their children. And the present is no exception, with a stripping of resources, dumbed-down, test-driven curriculum, and the hostile, racist school-to-prison climate that pervades too many schools and dehumanizes Black and brown children. So we need to rethink what we mean by defending public education. Yet the public school system, the flawed public school system, is an arena with the potential for us to fight for the schools and the society we want. Because it's public, we've been able to wrench gains out of the state. Black studies, equitable treatment for girls and women, for LGBT students, for bilingual education. In LA, parents and teachers force the Board of Education, or push the Board of Education, to make ethnic studies a mandatory high school requirement. There are amazing critical ethnic studies teachers using that space to decolonize education. I met some of them this summer. In the public system, we can demand inclusion, hold elected authorities accountable, or organize to make them elected, like in Chicago, where we're trying to get an elected school board. And we can build unions that represent all teachers in the district, giving us the power to unite parents and teachers across the city and shut down the city, like CTU did in 2012 and like we're going to do on Tuesday. Yay! So the public school system is a space to envision the society we want and to struggle for it. So what part of the public system do we want to defend? And how do we build a movement led by those least served by public schools to not just defend but transform public education? So protests are not enough. Opposition is not enough. We need our program, like the Chicago Teachers Union, Schools that Chicago Students Deserve, Adjust Chicago, Milwaukee's Schools and Communities that Students Deserve, the Journey for Justice Alliance program, the Dyett High School vision for a School of Global Leadership and Green Technology. We need to advance our agenda and not just oppose what's happening. And that's really critical to building a broader movement. Privatization is also more than charter schools. And you all know this. It's Ed, TPA, Pearson, Common Core, outsourcing of school services to private companies, you name it. In Chicago, the board outsourced school nurses, and now we have a severely impacted and already desperate lack of qualified school nurses. They outsource clinicians. They outsource food and custodial workers to Aramark, which is one of the top 7 corporations using prison labor. The food is even more inedible, sparking student protests, and the buildings are filthy, sparking principal protests. And increasingly, investors are going into online curriculum, virtual charters, software and technology connected to Common Core and testing. These are not programs in affluent schools. These are investments that are made to devalue, degrade, and undermine public schools serving children of color, working class children. They're insinuating themselves into the fibers of the public system, cannibalizing it, so that we're left with just the skeleton, bones picked clean. This is a very creative industry when it comes to money making, and that's actually where the innovation is. The privatization strategy is also stretching from K-12 to community colleges, and we see the City College of San Francisco. City College has been one of California's top community colleges and an anchor for working class and immigrant San Francisco. The California Student Success Act of 2012 would shrink the schools and their mission, prioritizing transfer to four-year schools and narrow the curriculum to workforce training. Remember the World Bank. What is happening at City College is a manufactured accreditation crisis that precipitated a sharp drop in enrollment. Since 2012, City College has lost 25,000 students. 774 classes have been canceled. I couldn't believe it when I read that. This is death by 1,000 cuts, just as in K-12 education. So this attempt to gut community colleges and working class institutions of higher learning and turn them into corporate labor force training is national and it's racist. And the Save City College movement has been strong. But I also know that there's a measure on the ballot for free city college. And so that's an example of how we don't just oppose what's happening to us, but actually put forward solutions to actually move things in our direction. So the question, though, is how do we link K-12 and higher education movements against privatization? How do we connect resistance to various forms of oppression, from EdTPA to Common Core to testing to charter schools? But the destruction of public schools is about more than privatization. The dismantling of public education is part of the attack on Black lives, on Latinx lives, and immigrant lives. I think too often the anti-privatization movement just talks about capital investment and capital accumulation and doesn't consider and think about the interrelated context of white supremacy and capitalism in this project. School closings and privatization have been devastating for working class communities of color in New Orleans, Chicago, Detroit, Newark, Philadelphia, and more. That's who's actually affected by it. In particular, the target's been Black communities. In Chicago, 87% of the students affected by school closings are African American. In Philadelphia, it was 81%. In Detroit, overwhelmingly African American. Closing neighborhood schools that were anchors of their communities further destabilizes these communities, pushes out working class and Latinx families, and clears the way for gentrification, which the students from June Jordan High School so powerfully talked about as what's happening in this city and in cities around the country. Moreover, to shutter public schools in Black communities named for Mahalia Jackson, Benjamin Banneker, Marcus Garvey, Mary McLeod Bethune, Wendell Phillips, Walter Dyett, signals that Black intellectual and cultural history, that Black people themselves are expendable. The collusion of the state and capital to dispossess people of color of their schools is part of a racialized urban agenda that includes dismantling public housing, foreclosing homes, closing clinics and hospitals, downsizing and privatizing public services. It destabilizes working class communities, and pushes out families. This racist agenda has driven the organizing by parents and students of color in cities across the U.S., giving birth to the National Journey for Justice Alliance. So what I'm saying is that this is not just an education agenda, it's also an urban agenda, and so we need to connect the dots and connect the movements. This process is also relational. Disposability of children in schools in working class and Latinx communities is linked to the overvaluing of schools and children in gentrified and upper middle class white areas, where school districts spare no cost to create selective enrollment, state-of-the-art magnet and quality schools, quality specialty schools. While neighborhood schools in Chicago have had their budgets cut almost 20%, CPS is building a new $70 million selective enrollment school on the Gold Coast, where the Cabrini Green public housing complex used to be. And that school is 3 blocks away from Walter Payton High School, another selective enrollment school that is in exactly the same neighborhood. In all the test score metrics and facility utilization formulas that they give us to justify school closings and charter expansion, there's little discussion of the human suffering. Closing a school breaks a web of human connections. It's an assault on children, families, and communities. It dehumanizes parents who are shut out from any real decision making. When CPS closed 50 schools in 2013, after 6 months of protests by thousands of parents, teachers, and students, parents said their children were grieving and they were grieving. One father said, quote, "It's like you just snatched the heart of our community out. You dismantled it, you blew it up, and it wasn't like it was something bad. It was something good." Maybe this is what Bruce Rauner means by blowing up the system. Veteran black teachers who devoted their lives to teaching have just been dismissed. This is a loss of pedagogical knowledge and community connection. Kevin Henry points out that black teachers are essential to our conceptualization of justice in schools. How we even think about social justice in schools has been shaped by black teachers. The loss of black teachers translates into a loss of black wealth and black labor rights, and that's why it's an attack on black communities. Before Katrina and the privatization of New Orleans schools, black teachers were 74% of the teaching force. After Katrina, and the state dismantled the mostly black teachers union. In 2012, African Americans were 51%. So it went from 74 to 51. In Chicago, black teachers plunged from 40% of the teaching force in 2000, 40%, to 23% today. That's school closings and privatization. The Dyett hunger strike in Chicago. You all heard about the Dyett hunger strike? That hunger strike made clear the determination of African American parents and brought to light community alternatives to the kind of education kids are getting. It wasn't just a fight for public schools. It was a fight for a new kind of public school with a humanizing vision. So let me say, since sounds like not everyone knows about it. In 2015, 12 parents, grandparents, and supporters launched a 34-day hunger strike to reopen Dyett High School, 34 days. Dyett was the last open enrollment neighborhood high school in the historic African-American Bronzeville area of Chicago. And Dyett is a case study in the everyday violence done to black schools through school district sabotage. After a decade of CPS disinvestment, CPS voted to close it in 2014. In the last years, Dyett students were taking art and PE online, and they were not allowed to use the multi-million-dollar gym in their school. They also were required to enter through the back door.
What?
After 3 years of protests, petitions, and civil disobedience, and the submission of 2 proposals for a new school were ignored, parents launched the hunger strike. The disregard for their lives by the officials who run Chicago and its schools demonstrated that Black lives do not matter to them. Even as several hunger strikers were hospitalized, they did nothing, even though nurses and doctors pleaded with the mayor, saying it was a life-threatening situation. They held a press conference to plead with the mayor. Connecting the state's response to the hunger strike to police murders, police violence, Anna Jones, one of the mothers on hunger strike, said, quote, "It's been very disappointing that the mayor of Chicago will allow us to die, even though we knew he would do that, because he's allowed Black children in our streets to die every day." When activists with the Movement for Black Lives marched from a rally against police murder to Dyett, where hunger strikers gathered, they connected the anti-Black state violence of police shootings with the anti-Black state violence of Chicago's education policies. The Coalition to Revitalize Dyett's proposal for the Dyett High School of Global Leadership and Green Technology came out of the community vision for a school that would nurture young people and prepare them to be critically conscious leaders in their community and beyond. And I don't have time to talk about this, but I just want to say that this proposal that was developed by parents meeting together over 2 years with educators, T4SJ and other community organizations were part of it, is a proposal for the kind of education that we wish all our children could have. And it could be a model for public education around the country. So this is an example of how a community's vision has to be put up against the vision both of the kind of schools we have and of the destruction of public schools. This fall, Dyett reopened as an open enrollment neighborhood school with a $14.7 million investment from CPS. This is a victory. This is the first time that we know of that a school district has closed a school, public school, and been forced to reopen it. But the struggle for the community's curriculum and values continues. Chicago just passed a horrifying milestone. Over 500 homicides so far this year. While public officials decry the violence, there's little discussion of the violence that created this situation. The violence of school closings, closing mental health clinics, cutting school nurses, social workers, counselors, and psychologists. The violence of lack of decent, affordable housing, living wage jobs, and gentrification. The violence of gentrification that the brilliant students from June Jordan made so very clear. This is not really any way to follow them up here. So Rahm's response to this violence is to put another 500 more police on the streets. And this is while Chicago already has the third highest per capita ratio of police in the 669 largest U.S. cities. Chicago allocates almost 40% of its operating budget to police, 40%. $1.4 billion annually, $4 million a day. Since 2014, the city paid out $662 million in settlements, awards, and legal fees to settle police abuse and torture cases. 1 day spent on policing is equivalent to what the city spends on 5 months of mental health services, 18 months of substance abuse treatment, and 32 months of violence prevention programs. There are more police in our schools than counselors. Funding police instead of the things that keep people healthy and safe is violence as state strategy. Which is actually why our annual conference, the Teaching for Social Justice Curriculum Affairs theme this year is Defund Policing, fund schools and communities. Abolish policing. A bold new youth-led Black liberation movement is exposing the lie of a post-racial society, shining a light on anti-Black state violence and the expendability of Black lives, and challenging the fundamental interrelated structures of capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy. A fierce campaign by the Movement for Black Lives in Chicago forced the mayor to fire the police chief, drove out the city-state's attorney, and drove Rahm's approval rating down to 27%. That's really the product of that movement. His education and policing policies have made him, according to Chicago Magazine, quote, the least popular mayor in modern Chicago history. So this is not just a result of the actions, but a result of the organizing and the movements that shined a light on these actions and framed it and made it understandable and clear to people. So, how are we building a movement that connects education and racial justice and racist state violence and immigrant justice? This is a moment when the state, from the federal government on down, has lost legitimacy. That's why Rahm has an approval rating of 27%. A crisis is a moment of danger and possibility. A racist, homophobic, misogynist, anti-immigrant, anti-Islam movement and discourse rooted in white resentment and fueled by economic insecurity is attempting to fill the void. We all know this. But a new Black liberation movement, immigrant rights, and education movement are concretely proposing programs for more humane futures. And we haven't even talked about climate justice and the indigenous earth protectors massed in Standing Rock. Students have always been in the forefront of social movements, and young people today are sharp critics of their social reality. And so this is a critical moment to be an educator. I was thinking about the metaphor, the really powerful metaphor, which I'm going to take back to Chicago, about sharpening our blades. That's what one of the critical roles that teachers can play, is to help students sharpen their blades to fight against oppression. So this is a really hard moment, but it's a really important and critical moment, and actually exciting moment to be an educator. So I think our challenge is to appreciate and grasp the possibilities of this moment. Not only looking at the attacks, but looking at the possibilities. And doing that in our classrooms and in the streets. An opportunity to educate and organize and figure out together how to link our education struggles with a broader social movement for a sustainable and just future. So I just want to end by quoting part of a paper that was written by a student of mine who's preparing to be a teacher. Her name is Nawal, and she asked me to say her name, actually. She says, it feels that the mayor may have bit off more than he can chew, and that parents are fed up. The tactics of corrupted public schools, and the storm is brewing against him. With parents this outraged, one can only hope that more Chicagoans will stand up against him. On a personal note, I am the oldest of 8 children who have all attended a public elementary school. Being the eldest, I've been to 4 different elementary schools. Some in rich neighborhoods, some in lower class neighborhoods. The difference is astounding. I know that I loved going to the rich school because of how lit up the classrooms were and how I adored the amount of color and the fun we would have. Then to switch rapidly to a lower class one really drove in what I had, even as a child. I knew the difference and it stayed with me until now. Studying to become a teacher in Chicago is probably really risky. but I know that I can do a lot of good. We need public schools that are healthy, creative, and empowering for students. The press conference, she went to, all my students are involved in this stuff. They went to a press conference of parents supporting the teachers. She said the press conference put into perspective for me that this isn't an impossible problem. But that the mayor is doing his best to get rid of it. But the mayor is doing his best to get rid of it. It's not an impossible problem. The mayor is doing his best to get rid of it. Our duty is to make sure our students get the schools they deserve, end quote. And I would add, the world they deserve. But this is more than sort of rhetoric. Some of the challenges that I talked about, I think are real challenges. And I think they're real challenges that we have to solve if we are going to both organize in our classrooms, our schools, and in the streets for the kind of movement that can actually grasp this moment of possibility. And I think the starting point is for us to grasp this moment ourselves, to appreciate that it is a moment of danger, but also a moment of possibility.